The ships moved slowly into the harbors of the American coast, their holds filled not with weapons or cargo but with men who had once called themselves soldiers of the Reich. They stepped down the gangways in silence, boots clattering on wooden planks, eyes narrowed against the glare of a foreign sun. Around them, guards watched with an ease that unsettled the prisoners. For months they had been told that capture meant humiliation, hunger, and cruelty. Instead, they found themselves herded onto trains that rattled inland across endless green fields, bound for camps that looked less like cages and more like towns waiting for occupants. Behind the barbed wire, the Germans whispered, trying to keep fragments of pride alive. And among those fragments, one name rose again and again like a talisman: Fanta. It seemed absurd to boast of a soft drink when one's nation lay in ruins, but pride is a stubborn creature. In Germany, before their capture, the orange-colored beverage had been more than just a bottle on a shelf. It was ingenuity, survival, the taste of something bright in the midst of war. While Allied bombs shook their cities and rations dwindled, Fanta had appeared like a trick of alchemy. Few outside Germany knew its strange origins, yet for the men behind the wire it was a story worth retelling, a reminder that German resourcefulness could turn scraps into sweetness. They spoke of it in their bunks, voices low, insisting that nothing in America, no matter how rich or sprawling, could rival it. The tale began in 1940, when the blockade severed the arteries of trade that once carried Coca-Cola syrup across the Atlantic. For years, Germans had tasted America's signature drink, bottled in local plants and sold from kiosks on Berlin's busy street. But when war closed the sea lanes, the formula could no longer be imported. Coca-Cola GmbH, the German branch of the company, faced collapse. Its director, Max Keith, was a businessman caught in a dilemma: either let the bottling plants fall silent or invent something new from whatever ingredients could be scavenged in wartime Germany. Out of that scarcity, Fanta was born, its name drawn from the German word fantasy, meaning imagination. The drink was not the glossy orange elixir known today. It was made from apple pomace, the fibrous leftovers from cider presses, and whey drained from cheese factories. Mixed with a little sugar when available, carbonated, and dyed a faint color, it became a beverage that filled glasses at meager family tables. Children loved it because it was sweet, adults tolerated it because there were few other luxuries, and soon Fanta became not just a drink but a statement. Germany would not be denied even the small pleasures of life. By 1943, millions of bottles were being sold each year inside the Reich. Soldiers on leave sipped it, families clutched it like a treat, and for many, it was a taste associated with resilience. So when the prisoners spoke of it in the American camps, they were not merely praising a soda. They were holding on to memory, onto something German that had not been taken by bombs or surrender. Fanta is the best, some said around their evening meals, thin smiles tugging at their faces. America has nothing like it. It was bravado, yes, but also a shield against the creeping realization that they were surrounded by a land larger and wealthier than they had ever imagined. Pride found strange vessels in captivity, and for these men, Fanta was one of them. The camps themselves surprised the prisoners. Located across the American South, Midwest, and even in faraway plains, they were run with an efficiency that felt almost gentle. The Geneva Conventions were respected more often than ignored, and many prisoners discovered that meals were plentiful, roofs sturdy, and guards more curious than cruel. The Americans allowed them to play soccer on weekends, to work on nearby farms, even to earn a few coins for labor. Letters home described the bewildering reality: we eat better here than our families do in Germany. Yet still, the Germans clung to their slivers of superiority. They told themselves that while America had size, it lacked refinement. It had wealth, but not taste. And nothing illustrated this better, they thought, than Fanta, something the Yankees could never match. On hot afternoons, the men lounged in the shade of their barracks, trading stories. Some spoke of battles now lost, others of the girls they had left behind, but invariably the conversation circled back to food and drink. Hunger had left scars, and memory made delicacies shine brighter than they truly were. Fanta was described in glowing detail, its fizz, its tang, its brightness against a backdrop of gray. New prisoners, freshly captured and shipped from Europe, added their own testimonials, and each retelling built the myth higher, until belief hardened into certainty. America could win with tanks and planes, perhaps, but when it came to the small pleasures of life, Germany still held the crown. The guards overheard such talk with smirks. To them, Coca-Cola was as common as tap water. It was the drink of picnics, baseball games, and factory shift. To imagine Germans boasting about a knockoff soda made from apple scraps seemed laughable. But the Americans also understood pride. They let the men keep their illusions, knowing that illusions had a way of collapsing on their own. And one summer day, the moment of collapse arrived. The sun blazed over the camp, turning the air thick and heavy. Dust clung to boots, and sweat traced lines down the backs of uniforms that had long since lost their crispness. A murmur rose from the gate as trucks pulled in, their engines growling low. The guards moved with casual precision, unloading wooden crates stacked high. The prisoners pressed against the fence, curious. Bottles clinked together with a sound that was both foreign and familiar, a music of glass promising refreshment. And then they saw the labels. Coca-Cola, printed bold in white against dark glass. At first, disbelief. The men blinked, muttered, laughed nervously. Some insisted it must be something else, a trick, perhaps even water in reused bottles. Yet as the crates were carried into the camp and the caps pried off, the scent of syrup and carbonation filled the air. The hiss of pressure released was unmistakable, the fizz of bubbles rising unmistakable. It was Coca-Cola itself, the true original, as common in America as bread. And here it was being handed not to free citizens but to prisoners, to men who had fought against the very nation now quenching their thirst. Hands hesitated. Pride stiffened backs. Some swore under their breath that they would not touch it. Others reached eagerly, curiosity outweighing defiance. The first bottles were passed around, the glass cool and beaded with condensation, the liquid within dark as molasses yet sparkling. The liquid within dark as molasses yet sparkling. The Germans lifted them to their lips, some sneering, some cautious, some secretly hopeful. And in that moment, the myth of Fanta met the reality of Coke. The taste was unlike anything they remembered. Rich, layered, sweet without being thin, it coated the tongue and lingered. The fizz stung pleasantly at the back of the throat. It was indulgence in liquid form, a drink not born of scarcity but of surplus, not of improvisation but of mastery. The Germans exchanged glances, their bravado faltering. A few muttered grudging admiration. Others said nothing, but their silence was loud. The comparison needed no debate. Fanta had been their pride, but Coke was a revelation. The guards watched with half-hidden smiles. They had seen this before, men stripped not by beatings but by abundance. The prisoners drank, some quickly, some slowly, until the bottles were empty and only the echoes of clinking glass remained. For the first time, many understood in their bones what statistics and battles had only suggested. America was not just stronger militarily. It was stronger in ways that touched daily life, in food, in leisure, in the simple casual luxury of handing out Coca-Cola to enemy soldiers. Yet pride does not die easily. That evening, in the barracks, the men tried to talk themselves back into defiance. It is too sweet, some complained. It is childish. Others insisted Fanta had a charm Coke could never match. But their voices wavered, and laughter undercut the seriousness. They knew the truth, and the truth was bitterer than any defeat on the battlefield. Germany's invention, treasured and boasted of, was a shadow beside the abundance of America. Around campfires and in letters home, the story would be repeated, each time softened or twisted to save face. But deep down, the realization had already settled. Fanta was improvisation, Coke was empire. One was survival, the other victory. And though the prisoners did not say it aloud, many felt it. The war was more than lost. It had been unwinnable from the start, against a nation that could make even sweetness a weapon of power. As the night fell and the guards collected the empty bottles, the sound of glass rattling in crates lingered like a reminder. The Germans lay awake, staring at the rafters, the taste of Coke still on their tongues, sweeter than pride and heavier than defeat. They had been certain nothing could surpass what Germany had made from scraps. But now they had seen abundance poured casually into their hands, and the knowledge gnawed at them. Tomorrow they would boast again of Fanta, perhaps. But tonight, in the silence of their bunks, many whispered to themselves what they dared not say aloud. America's strength was not just in its armies. It was in the small, effortless luxuries that made defeat undeniable. And though the camp fell quiet, the echo of that realization grew louder, a shadow stretching into the future. What other truths waited to dismantle their illusions? What other comparisons would strip away their defenses, one sip at a time? If the Germans behind the wire clung to Fanta as proof of their resourcefulness, Americans outside those fences moved through a world where sweetness was not a symbol of survival but a constant companion. Coca-Cola had threaded itself into the American story long before the prisoners ever laid eyes on a bottle in camp. To understand what those men tasted, one must step back and see what Coke meant to the nation that created it. For in America, Coca-Cola was not simply a drink. It was a ritual, a promise, a mirror of the country's astonishing capacity to turn abundance into identity. The story stretched back to the late 19th century, when a pharmacist in Atlanta concocted a syrup laced with coca leaves and cola nuts, first sold at soda fountains for a nickel a glass. By the turn of the century, Coca-Cola had already outgrown its hometown. Its logo, the flowing script in bright red and white, became recognizable from coast to coast. By the 1920s, billboards proclaimed it on highways, advertisements in magazines paired it with modern lifestyles, and bottling plants multiplied like railway stations across the land. A single company had managed to make sweetness into a universal language, and Americans embraced it with a zeal that startled Europeans who visited. By the time the Great Depression cast its shadow, Coca-Cola had transformed again. While breadlines snaked through cities, Coke remained 5 cents, a small indulgence that millions could still afford. It was liquid reassurance, a taste of normalcy even when jobs vanished and banks shuttered. When Prohibition ended and alcohol returned to legal shelves, Coca-Cola did not vanish. Instead, it learned to live alongside stronger drinks, mixing with rum or whiskey, adapting, always present. Unlike Fanta, which was born out of absence, Coca-Cola thrived because America overflowed. It did not ask people to compromise. It asked them to believe they could have both hardship and sweetness, both labor and leisure. And that belief, repeated millions of times, hardened into culture. By the 1940s, that culture was global. The United States entered the war with a determination not only to defeat enemies but to preserve its way of life. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, architect of the European campaign, requested not just tanks and ammunition but Coca-Cola bottling plants to follow the troop. At the company's headquarters in Atlanta, executives promised that every American soldier, wherever he fought, would be able to buy a Coke for a nickel. That vow unleashed an industrial campaign as vast as any military maneuver. Dozens of bottling plants sprang up in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific, each producing thousands of bottles a day. By war's end, more than 5 billion servings had been distributed to soldiers. To a weary private crouched in the mud, Coca-Cola was not just refreshment. It was America, bottled and carried to the front lines. Against this backdrop, the German prisoners' loyalty to Fanta seemed almost comic. Fanta had been a product of scarcity, a concoction designed to keep German factories alive when the syrup shipments stopped. Coca-Cola, by contrast, expanded in wartime, as if America's wealth could not be contained even by global conflict. The irony was bitter. The very blockade that had forced Germans to create Fanta had given Americans another opportunity to showcase their limitless resources. For the men in the camps, holding a bottle of Coke was not simply about flavor. It was about touching the material evidence of a civilization whose power seemed to grow the more it was tested. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In Germany, Fanta was rationed, bought with precious coupons, sometimes watered down when sugar ran scarce. In America, Coca-Cola was tossed from trucks to factory workers, stacked in coolers at baseball games, and served in camp to enemy prisoners as if it were nothing at all. What Germany treasured, America handed out like sunlight. That disparity cut deeper than bayonets or bullets. It revealed an imbalance of abundance that no battlefield victory could disguise. And yet, in the camps, sweetness did more than taunt. It confused. Many prisoners had braced themselves for cruelty, starvation, perhaps even revenge. Instead, they found themselves well-fed, allowed to write letters, sometimes taken to work in fields where local farmers offered them sandwiches or pie. The Coke bottles, fizzing in the heat, were part of that bewilderment. How could the enemy, the nation that had dropped bombs on their cities, afford to be so casual with comfort? To the Germans, every swallow of Coca-Cola seemed to whisper the same truth: you are not only defeated, you are outclassed in every measure of daily life. Numbers added to the shock. By the mid-1940s, Coca-Cola was bottled in more than 40 countries, employing tens of thousands of workers, with a distribution system that rivaled the logistics of armies. More than 60% of Americans drank it regularly, and in some towns, soda fountains served more Coke in a week than Fanta plants in Germany could produce in a month. The sheer scale of it was staggering. For a German soldier who remembered scraping together coins to buy a single bottle of Fanta, the abundance was humiliating. America did not simply make war. It manufactured pleasure on an industrial scale. Coca-Cola became a cultural ambassador. Photographs showed GIs raising bottles in dusty villages, handing them to children, sharing them with allies. The drink slipped into war memoirs, into songs, even into political speeches. It was framed as proof that democracy was not gray and austere but colorful, effervescent, joyous. It was America distilled. Sweet, bold, everywhere at once. For Germans raised on the rhetoric of superiority, the message was devastating. Here was a nation that did not need to lecture about greatness, could pour it into a glass. The prisoners did not speak of these realizations openly, at least not at first. Pride demanded silence, or deflection, or jokes muttered in the dark. Some claimed the drink was too sugary, too childish, unsophisticated. Others mocked the way Americans seemed obsessed with it, as if Coke were a religion. But denial frayed quickly. Each new shipment into the camps chipped away at resistance. And the more they saw guards casually sipping bottles during duty, the more the Germans understood that Coca-Cola was not a treat but a baseline. In America, sweetness was not rationed. It was assumed. For men who had fought under banners declaring the Reich eternal, this discovery unsettled more than their palates. It cracked the narrative that had sustained them. If Fanta symbolized cleverness under pressure, Coca-Cola symbolized something larger, a system so wealthy and organized that even luxuries became mundane. In the arithmetic of power, this difference mattered. Nations that relied on scraps could not compete with nations that overflowed. That realization, embodied in the hiss of a bottle cap, pressed on the prisoners more forcefully than any lecture. There was irony here too, and the Americans knew it. Some guards teased the prisoners, asking if their German soda still seemed superior. Others laughed privately at the stubbornness with which men defended a drink they had once considered an embarrassment. But most recognized that pride was the last weapon prisoners could wield, and they allowed them to hold it until reality dissolved it. Coca-Cola did not need propaganda. Its existence was argument enough. The more the prisoners adjusted to camp life, the more they noticed that Coke was everywhere. On the radio, jingles praised it. In the newspapers they were allowed to read, Advertisements paired it with images of cheerful families, soldiers, athletes. Even in the smallest towns where they worked as laborers, gas stations and diners carried coolers filled with the bottles. It became clear that Coca-Cola was not simply a drink. It was an institution woven into the fabric of the nation. And unlike Fanta, which had clung to survival through improvisation, Coca-Cola thrived because America thrived. It rode on rails, flew on planes, followed soldiers into battle. It was, in its own way, a soldier too, armed not with bullets but with ubiquity. As weeks turned to months, the prisoners' laughter grew quieter when the subject of soda arose. Some confessed admiration. Others wrote letters home, cautiously describing the strange abundance they encountered. "We drink Coca-Cola here," one letter read, "as if it were water." Imagine that! Families back in Germany could scarcely believe it. For them, Fanta remained a treasured rarity, rationed carefully, its sweetness stretched thin. To hear that their captured sons were drinking Coke freely seemed both absurd and bitterly unfair. Yet those letters carried truth, and truth spread, even when unwelcome. The symbolism deepened as the war edged toward its end. News trickled into the camps. Allied victories, German cities in ruins, surrender on the horizon. Each announcement chipped away at pride. And each bottle of Coca-Cola reinforced the sense that defeat was not only military but cultural. America's factories could build more planes and ships than Germany could imagine, yes. But they could also fill trains with soda, flood markets with sweetness, ensure that even prisoners tasted it. That combination, steel and sugar, was irresistible. It explained not only how America won battles but how it defined victory itself. To taste Coke, then, was to taste the scale of America. It was a sensory lesson in power, one more vivid than charts or speeches. The prisoners learned it sip by sip, until resistance became hollow. Fanta might still carry nostalgia, but nostalgia was no match for reality. Each cap twisted off, each fizzing pour, announced the same verdict. The Reich's boasts were smaller than America's routines. And the men who had once boasted behind the wire now fell quiet, staring at bottles that reflected their own diminished pride. The transformation was not immediate. Pride dies slowly, often with flares of denial. Yet in the hush of evenings, as guards collected empty bottles, the Germans lay on their bunks and stared at rafters, tasting the afterglow of Coke on their tongues. The flavor lingered, heavy with meaning. It was more than sugar. It was empire, casual and unshakable. And though they would not admit it aloud, they felt themselves shrinking against the enormity of what they had glimpsed. One day, as another truck pulled into the camp, loaded again with crates, a murmur ran through the prisoners, not of defiance but of uneasy anticipation. They knew what waited inside. And as the guards swung the crates down and the bottles rattled in their wooden frames, the Germans realized that the contest between Fanta and Coke was not just about drink. It was about worlds colliding, and one of those worlds had already proven larger than their imaginations could hold. The camp was still when the bottles came again, sunlight glinting off the glass as if it carried more than syrup, more than fizz, more than refreshment. To the German prisoners, those crates of Coca-Cola were no longer a curiosity but an intrusion into their pride, an unavoidable reminder that the smallest luxuries could reveal a nation's true size. They gathered near the tables where guards stacked the bottles, boots crunching over gravel, voices tight with bravado they no longer fully believed. The ritual of distribution had begun to feel like a trial, each man forced to measure his loyalty to memory against the undeniable sweetness in his hand. The first time, shock had silenced them. Now, anticipation sharpened their unease. Some whispered arguments. Coca-Cola was too sweet, too simple, unworthy of serious men. Others admitted privately, in tones laced with shame, that it was irresistible. Still others said nothing, their silence more eloquent than denial. What united them all was the recognition that the drink had become symbolic. This was not about refreshment. It was about whether German invention, represented by Fanta, could stand against the industrial and cultural might of America. Each bottle uncapped was another battlefield, and each sip carried consequences heavier than sugar. The guards understood none of this fully, or perhaps they understood it too well and enjoyed the irony. To them it was routine: hand out bottles, watch the men's expressions, collect empties later. Some guards grinned as they passed them along, others offered no more attention than if they were handing out bread. That casualness stung. For the prisoners, the bottles were heavy with meaning; for the guards, they were just Coke. That imbalance itself was a lesson, more cutting than lectures about democracy or freedom. To hold in one's hand what the enemy considered ordinary was to feel the hollowness of one's own former certainty. On one particular afternoon, the heat pressed thick over the camp, and the air vibrated with the sound of cicadas. The bottles hissed as caps were pried off with quick flicks of metal. Carbonation foamed at the necks, tiny beads racing upward like sparks. A hush spread as the Germans raised them. And then came the first swallow, the syrupy cold striking tongues, fizz rushing against the roof of mouths, sweetness unfolding in layers richer than memory. It was familiar now, yet still astonishing, like tasting a truth that refused to dull with repetition. Around the tables, eyes flickered. Some narrowed in irritation, others widened with reluctant pleasure. A few closed altogether, as if savoring something forbidden. They had clung to Fanta as proof of their ingenuity, but Fanta had never done this. It had never left men silent, humbled not by defeat in arms but by comparison in taste. Coca-Cola was not better because it mocked Fanta, it was better because it made Fanta irrelevant. One was a drink cobbled from scraps. The other was a product of machinery, logistics, and an economy that did not know desperation. Every swallow told the story, one nation surviving, another thriving. The prisoners argued still, though the words grew weaker with each bottle. One man insisted that Fanta was more natural, less artificial. Another claimed that Germans valued subtlety, while Americans drowned everything in sugar. But their tone betrayed them. They spoke not with conviction but with the desperation of men trying to salvage dignity. Others did not bother. They drank quietly, faces unreadable, but their empty bottles clinked against wood like confessions. Silence became the loudest admission. They preferred it. They knew it. And that knowledge corroded the pride that once sustained them. Evenings in the barracks changed. Once, men had boasted about Fanta, describing its tang, its place at family tables, the way children smiled when a rare bottle appeared. Now those stories faltered. Laughter replaced boasting, but the laughter was tinged with bitterness. They remembered drinking Fanta watered down, rationed carefully, treasured like gold. They compared that memory to Coke handed out freely by their captors. The contrast gnawed at them. It was one thing to lose battles. It was another to realize the enemy could defeat them without firing a shot, simply by showing how effortlessly it provided sweetness to those it held in chains. Letters home carried this confusion. Some described camp life with surprising comfort, noting that food was plentiful, that guards were not cruel, that work on farms was bearable. A few dared to mention Coca-Cola, describing its ubiquity, its taste, the strange way it seemed to embody America itself. Families in Germany, rationing scraps, read those words with disbelief. A prisoner of war drinking luxuries while civilians queued for hours to buy bread. It seemed impossible, insulting even. Yet the testimonies multiplied, each one reinforcing the truth. America's abundance spilled into every corner, even into the lives of its enemies. In time, the bottles became more than refreshment. They became mirrors, forcing the Germans to see their own defeat from new angles. They had fought believing in superiority, superior discipline, superior culture, superior innovation. Yet here they were, savoring something as ordinary to their captors as water, and realizing that their vaunted ingenuity had been a child's toy beside the machines of American plenty. The fizzing sweetness was not just flavor, it was revelation, one that stung more deeply than propaganda ever could. Coca-Cola also became ritual, part of the rhythm of camp life. Trucks rolled in, crates unloaded, bottles distributed. The men accepted them now with less resistance, but also with more awareness. Each bottle seemed to remind them of the world outside the wire, a world larger than their imagination had allowed. They began to notice details they once ignored. The way guards drank casually, tossing caps into the dirt. The way advertisements for Coke appeared in newspapers, pairing the drink with smiling families or victorious soldiers. The way even farmers in small towns seemed to treat it as an afterthought. That casual ubiquity cut deeper than any lecture. It showed that what they treasured was, to America, nothing at all. One prisoner, once defiant, was seen holding his bottle longer than the others after finishing it, staring at the glass as if it contained more than soda. When asked what he thought, he shook his head and muttered, "It tastes like victory." The phrase spread quietly through the camp, repeated with half-ironic smiles, yet each repetition carried weight. Victory, they realized, was not only measured in territory or battles. It was measured in the ability to make luxury ordinary, to turn sweetness into a symbol of national identity. Fanta had been born of necessity. Coca-Cola was born of choice. That difference was unbridgeable. The guards noticed the shift. Where once they heard Germans boast about Fanta, now they heard silence, or jokes, or grudging compliments. They teased them less, sensing the battle was already won. Coke required no defense. It stood on its own, undeniable, its presence more persuasive than any guard's words. The prisoners had been forced to taste what abundance meant, and once tasted, it could not be untasted. Pride might linger, but conviction had melted away. The wider war pressed on, and news filtered into the camp of Germany's crumbling front, of cities flattened, of surrender looming closer each day. Against that backdrop, the bottles became even more symbolic. Each time they clinked on tables, each time foam fizzed at the neck, it was as if the drink announced the future. The Reich fading, America rising. The prisoners drank and knew that in their hands was more than refreshment, it was prophecy. And yet, within this transformation, emotion churned. There was humiliation, yes, but also awe. Some prisoners marveled at the scale of it all, whispering that no nation could ever be defeated that possessed such endless abundance. Others fell into quiet despair, recognizing that their cause had been doomed from the start, not only by arms but by economics, by culture, by symbols like Coke that proved the depth of America's reach. Still others clung to denial, insisting that soda meant nothing, that true strength lay elsewhere. But even they could not stop their hands from reaching for bottles when offered, could not deny the refreshment that soothed their throats on hot days. Pride withered before thirst, and thirst told the truth. The camp itself became a stage for this quiet drama. Men sat on benches, sipping slowly, each lost in thought. Some joked, trying to lighten the weight of realization. Others grew reflective, staring at the horizon as if seeing beyond the barbed wire into the future. Guards passed by, unconcerned, their bottles half-finished, tossed aside. The ground around the camp grew littered with caps and shards of glass, each piece another reminder of glass, each piece another reminder of what had been consumed, of what had been learned. The landscape itself became marked by the lesson, as if even the soil bore witness to the transformation. In the long arc of history, it was a small thing, men drinking soda in a prison camp. Yet within that small thing lay the essence of power. It revealed not only who held the guns but who could shape everyday life so casually that even prisoners tasted abundance. The Germans came to see Coca-Cola not as a drink but as a teacher, instructing them in the realities of defeat. They had once believed that nothing could surpass what they had made from scraps. Now they knew that scraps could never compare to surplus. That truth could not be escaped. As the days shortened and the war's end approached, the significance of those bottles deepened still further. Some prisoners began to speak openly of their admiration, even envy. "If this is what they give us," one remarked, "what do they keep for themselves?" The question hung heavy in the air, unanswerable but undeniable. The men looked at their bottles and imagined American homes, American factories, American lives, overflowing with abundance. That imagination was more crushing than any guard's rifle. And in the quiet of one evening, after another round of bottles had been collected, the prisoners lay in their bunks, restless. The camp was silent save for the chirp of insects. Yet in that silence, one could almost hear the echo of caps hissing, of fizz rising, of sweetness unfolding. It was as if the taste lingered not only on tongues but in memory, a reminder that pride had been pierced, that superiority had been unmasked. The Germans closed their eyes, but the realization remained. Every sip had been a confession, every bottle an admission. They had been beaten not only in war but in the smallest, most human of comparisons. As they drifted into uneasy sleep, the thought spread quietly among them, unspoken yet shared. If Coca-Cola could undo their pride so easily, what else waited to dismantle the illusions they still carried? The answer, they suspected, was coming soon. The camp settled into routine, yet routine carried its own revelations. Each day mirrored the one before, work details on nearby farms, meals eaten at long wooden tables, evenings spent in barracks heavy with memory. But beneath that rhythm, change had already taken root. The bottles of Coca-Cola had done more than quench thirst. They had planted an idea, one that grew silently, reshaping the prisoners' sense of themselves and of the world they once believed they understood. What began as a sip of sweetness became a meditation on the future, a recognition that the war they had lost was only the beginning of a deeper defeat. In Germany, they had believed propaganda that painted America as shallow, decadent, incapable of seriousness. They were told that the Reich represented discipline and endurance, while America represented only consumerism and comfort. And yet here in captivity, with every bottle handed to them, that narrative unraveled. If America's supposed weakness produced this abundance, then what did strength look like? The thought haunted them. They began to see Coca-Cola not as a trivial indulgence but as a window into a civilization that could afford to turn luxuries into habits, that could weave sweetness into daily life without strain. The drink was ordinary to Americans, yet extraordinary to them, and that difference revealed a future they could not deny. Some prisoners tried to resist the implication. They argued still, insisting that a bottle of soda meant nothing, that true culture came from music, art, philosophy, not sugar water. But those words rang hollow in the face of experience. In America, culture and consumption were intertwined. A song played on the radio was paired with an advertisement for Coke. A soldier in a photograph raised a bottle as easily as he raised a flag. A factory produced not only bombs but also millions of bottles shipped overseas. The lesson was unmistakable. America had discovered how to turn symbols into power, how to transform ordinary products into emblems of national identity. The prisoners could laugh at it, but they could not dismiss it. Letters arriving from home deepened the contrast. Families wrote of shortages, of scraping together meals from potatoes and turnips, of standing in lines for hours to buy bread. Some letters mentioned Fanta, remembered fondly as one of the few bright tastes left in a rationed world. To the men in camp, those words cut deeply. They had once shared that pride, once believed that Fanta was a testament to German creativity. But now they held Coke in their hands, drank it freely, and knew the comparison was cruel. How could they write back and admit that they, prisoners, were drinking what their families could not even imagine? Many chose silence, others downplayed the truth, but the knowledge lingered like a stone in the chest. The guards noticed the change. They no longer heard boasts about Fanta. They saw instead the way prisoners accepted Coke without hesitation, the way their eyes lingered on the bottles. Some guards teased them, joking that maybe the war would end with a toast of soda instead of signatures on paper. Others grew quiet, sensing that something larger was unfolding. Something about pride giving way not through violence but through symbols. In their own casual way, The guards recognized that Coca-Cola had become part of the education of these men, a curriculum of humility taught not by lectures but by taste. The war outside the camp raced toward conclusion. News filtered in of cities bombed, of Allied armies advancing, of Germany's collapse. Each announcement struck the prisoners like a blow, yet it was the everyday abundance around them that truly sank in. They heard music on the radio, watched farmers drive trucks filled with goods, saw children in nearby towns laughing with bottles of Coke in hand. The juxtaposition was unbearable. Their own homeland reduced to rubble, their families scraping by, while their captors seemed to live in a world of plenty untouched by the hardship of war. The more they saw, the more they understood that America's strength was not only military. It was structural, cultural, inexhaustible. One prisoner, once a schoolteacher, remarked quietly to his bunkmates, "This drink is their flag." The others scoffed at first, but then fell silent. The others scoffed at first, but then fell silent. The idea held. Coca-Cola was not just sweetness. It was a banner of identity, a promise carried everywhere Americans went. On battlefields, in towns, in camps, the drink announced America's presence. It told enemies and allies alike that this was a nation that could package its way of life, bottle it, and send it across oceans. That realization struck harder than any weapon. It showed that America's reach was not limited to armies. It extended into taste, into desire, into the symbols that defined how people imagined the future. Some prisoners began to imagine that future more vividly. What would happen after the war, when they returned home? Would Coca-Cola follow them there, invading markets once dominated by local brews and sodas? Would German families, who once treasured Fanta as a national invention, come to prefer this American drink? The thought unsettled them. Yet they also knew it was inevitable. If America could conquer their pride in a prison camp, it could certainly conquer their markets in peacetime. The bottle in their hand felt suddenly prophetic, a glimpse of a world where America's cultural reach stretched across borders as easily as its armies had crossed oceans. The irony deepened in the months that followed. As Germany surrendered and Europe began to rebuild, Coca-Cola did indeed move swiftly into occupied territories, establishing bottling plants, sponsoring events, marketing itself as the taste of peace as well as war. Some of the very prisoners who had tasted it first behind barbed wire now saw it again on the streets of their liberated towns. They watched children sip it, shopkeepers sell it, advertisements painted on walls. The prophecy had come true, and they had seen it before anyone else. The bottle had told the future, and the future belonged to America's symbols as much as to its armies. Even within the camp, the transformation was undeniable. The prisoners' conversations shifted. No longer did they boast of German superiority. Instead, they spoke of survival, of families, of what might come after defeat. Coca-Cola had helped strip away illusions, forcing them to confront not only that they had lost but why they had lost. They saw that their nation had relied on improvisation, on scarcity dressed as ingenuity, while America had relied on abundance, on systems that turned luxuries into norms. That difference was more decisive than any battle, and it was captured in every sip of soda they took. At night, as they lay in their bunks, the memory of that taste lingered. It was more than refreshment now. It was a reminder of the gap between what they believed and what was real, between the Reich's promises and America's capacity. Some prisoners hated it, resenting the way it unmasked their pride. Others admired it, marveling at the scale of it all. But none could forget it. The sweetness had burned itself into memory, inseparable from the realization that their world had changed forever. The end of the war confirmed what the bottles had already revealed. Germany surrendered, the Reich dissolved, and the prisoners faced an uncertain return to a homeland in ruins. But the lesson of Coca-Cola followed them. They had learned that power was not only about weapons or armies. It was about symbols that carried meaning deeper than speeches. America had shown them that abundance itself could be a weapon, that a bottle of soda could dismantle illusions as effectively as bombs dismantled cities. 4 decades afterward, many of those former prisoners would remember their first sip, their first shock, their first recognition that pride built on scraps could not stand against abundance. They might tell the story to children or keep it to themselves, but the memory endured. It was a private reminder of how the war had truly been lost, not only in battles fought with steel and blood, but in comparisons fought with sugar and glass. The bottle had told the future. It had shown them a world where America's way of life would spread, carried not only by soldiers but by products, by advertisements, by symbols that seeped into daily existence. It had shown them that their defeat was more than military. It was cultural, economic, and psychological. And as they walked out of the camps, free but broken, they carried that knowledge with them like an invisible burden. One evening, as the sun set behind the barbed wire for the last time, a guard collected the final round of empty bottles. The glass clinked together, a sound that had become part of the camp's rhythm. The prisoners watched silently, their faces unreadable, their thoughts hidden. Yet in that silence lay understanding. They had seen the future, and it had been poured into their hands, fizzy and sweet, as ordinary to their captors as bread. That was the measure of their defeat. And though they would walk free, they knew they carried within them a taste that would never fade, a taste that reminded them not of refreshment, but of a truth larger than pride. The guard paused, hefting the crate, and glanced at the men. "Plenty more where that came from," he said lightly, before turning away. The words hung in the air, casual yet heavy, echoing louder than any speech. For the prisoners, it was a final reminder that America's abundance was endless, that what they had seen here was only the beginning. The bottles rattled as the guard carried them off, fading into the distance. The men watched until he disappeared, their silence deep, their thoughts restless. And in that silence, a question settled like a stone. If a bottle could reveal so much, what else waited in the future to dismantle the illusions they still carried? The answer loomed ahead, vast and undeniable, just beyond the horizon.